Joining us here in Washington is Gregory Poling, a fellow for Southeast Asia Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's also serving as the director of the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative. With us from Beijing is the director of the China National Association of International Studies, Victor Gao. Ming Wan is here in the studio, a professor of government and politics at George Mason University. And with us from Singapore is Lim Tai Wei. He's a senior lecturer at UniSIM College and an adjunct research fellow at the National University of Singapore's East Asian Institute. And let's start in Singapore. Obviously, Chinese President Xi Jinping, their very high-profile visit. What do you think was achieved in Singapore, sir?
I think bilaterally between Singapore and China, possibly the most important takeaway is the announcement of the third government-to-government project in Chongqing city. And this city is very important because it is seen as one of the most strategic locations on the Chinese Western region that will be one of the beachheads for the One Belt, One Road initiative by Beijing. And One Belt, One Road is the major foreign policy initiative. In fact, you can even call it economic diplomacy for Beijing. And because of this announcement, Singapore is going to be participating in the Chongqing government-to-government project. That's probably the most important takeaway out of the meeting between President Xi and Prime Minister Li of Singapore.
Yeah, let's bring in Victor Gao, because, of course, that's the third big government-to-government project that Singapore and China are doing. And the One Belt, One Road initiative, obviously linking Western China through Central Asia, eventually Europe, and the maritime equivalent as well. Centerpiece in Chinese policy, Victor. And, of course, it wasn't just Singapore, but also Vietnam, very central in these trips.
Oh, definitely. I think President Xi Jinping's visit to Singapore on a bilateral basis is very profound and significant, mainly because President Xi Jinping has given personal credit to Singapore for providing a lot of inspiration for China's reform. And you may know that towards the end of the 1970s, the late paramount leader Deng Xiaoping paid a visit to Singapore and met with former Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew and drew a lot of inspiration from what the Singaporeans could do. And ever since then, for the last 37 years or so, China has drawn again and again upon the track record and experiences that the Singaporeans have built up. You mentioned the third kind of industrial park that Singapore will help China to build. In this case, it will be in Chongqing, but the first one started in early 1990s in Suzhou, my hometown, and the second one was more recent in Tianjin. And I think this visit is basically a recognition of Singapore's role, and also in thanking Singapore for providing good offices between mainland China and Taiwan. For many years, Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, the former Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, actually played important good offices, and his successor, the current Prime Minister of Singapore, continued to play that good offices. That actually laid the foundation for Singapore to be chosen as the venue for this very important historic summit meeting between the leaders of mainland China, Mr. Xi Jinping, and the leader of Taiwan, Ma Ying-jeou. So I would say this visit to Singapore achieved two goals. One, purely bilateral between China and Singapore, but secondly, equally, if not even more important, between mainland China and Taiwan, both with splendid success, and it will be really carved into history books.
Ming Wan, let me bring you here in the studio. What was your takeaway from the Vietnam visit? Because if you go back to May 2014, there were tensions between Vietnam and China.
Right, and clearly the Chinese government is making a strong effort to improve relations with Vietnam because of the recent tension in the South China Sea. And they have also reached a number of agreements and very tangible achievements, and also symbolically, and they want to maintain the top-level exchange. But at the same time, the tension remains over the South China Sea, and right after President Xi Jinping visit, the Japanese defense minister visited Vietnam. So Vietnam is clearly trying to maintain a balance, and they want to maintain a working relationship and maybe even better relationship with China. But at the same time, they are also interested in defending what they view as their national interests.
And they really widened it out from the South China Sea, especially with the One Belt, One Road that Victor was going into. Greg, let me bring you in here. You're an expert on the South China Sea. What was interesting to me in this visit was they actually agreed to do joint exploration in the Beibu Gulf, which is the Vietnamese call the Gulf of Tonkin, which of course is near Hainan Island, expected to be resource rich. Is this a model for cooperation in the future?
Well, I think on this one, the devil's in the details. This is when the delimitation of the Beibu Gulf or Gulf of Tonkin was signed in 2000. The decision was to set aside the Gulf of, or the mouth of the Gulf, closer to disputed waters around the Paracels for later. I think whether or not they actually follow through is going to be key, because there have been attempts to do this for a decade now, and they've never really gotten beyond the agreement to start.
There is this feeling, though, joint exploration like this can lead to a managing of tensions.
In theory, but this is one tiny area of one very large disputed waters.
I just want to go back to Victor Gao in Beijing. Vietnam and China history is very rich and goes back a long time, but this One Belt, One Road initiative and the initiatives with Vietnam and China, we're talking about the railway, we're talking about investment. Could that bear fruit very quickly in the strategic sense as well as the economic?
Well, I would say Vietnam is at a very important crossroad and also at a threshold, mainly because between China and Vietnam, these two countries have already settled their border dispute along the land border. So we've signed a boundary treaty already. Now, for the maritime boundary, as far as the Bay of Tonkin is concerned, China and Vietnam have also demarcated their maritime borderline in that particular body of water. What's missing is in the South China Sea part, and the two countries do have maritime territorial disputes. However, given the fact that China and Vietnam share a very long land border, and the two countries have very similar, if not even identical, political system. And the two countries were basically comrades in arms in the 1950s and 60s and early 1970s when Vietnam was fighting against the French colonizers as well as the American troops in Vietnam. There are a lot of common interests and similarities between Vietnam and China. And now that China is pushing forward with this One Belt, One Road initiative, Vietnam, if it plays its role properly, can win and benefit tremendously in this infrastructure and connectivity initiative. But if Vietnam miscalculates or bets on the wrong horse, Vietnam may basically miss out. China is now proposing to build 3 main railway connections between the Chinese border all the way down to Singapore. One through Myanmar, another one through Laos, another one through Vietnam. And if Vietnam doesn't want to do it, then the choice may go either to Myanmar or to Laos. So I think there is a little bit of positive competition, and I hope Vietnam will seize the moment, demonstrate a lot of wisdom and courage and vision, and play it both for its own benefit as well as for the regional benefit of ASEAN countries.
I'm glad you brought up ASEAN countries. Let's go back to one of them as well, Lim Tai-wei in Singapore. There was also a lot of talk about updating the free trade agreement in the ASEAN area. Also very much focus on Singapore being an advocate for the internationalization of the Chinese currency. Do you think there's been big progress there?
Well, not in this meeting, because the meeting this time round is much more on broader issues, on diplomatic connections. So I think Singapore has always expressed an interest to be an international renminbi trading center, an offshore one. And I think Singapore is in a good position to be one. And they have not talked about the details yet in this particular meeting, but I'm sure that the officials at all levels have been consulting with each other. Singapore is well placed. It is possibly the most one of the most advanced financial hubs in ASEAN. It is well placed to be an offshore renminbi trading center, and it has facilities that can be of value add to Chinese companies that are trying to come into Southeast Asia or to list on the Singaporean stock market in order to reach a Southeast Asian consumer market. Right. ASEAN is going to be a very important player. It has a 500 million people consumer market in the future, and it is integrating its markets with each other very quickly. And so in the future, we could possibly see Chinese participation in ASEAN in the near future. And China already is one of the largest foreign direct investor in individual ASEAN countries. Yes. It is also one of the leading 3 investors in Singapore itself. So I think there's great complementarity. But another important point is that Singapore is also the largest investor in China. So these statistics help to show that the future role of the 2 countries in trying to have economic exchanges.
Ming Wan, I just want to bring you in here on that. Trade between China and ASEAN, $480 billion in 2014. Yeah. Quite an incredible number. Given that we've got the TPP going on, the US-backed TPP, Vietnam's a partner. We've got China pushing for an upgrading ASEAN FTA. What's going on here regionally?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting features in East Asian international relations is that almost all the countries are trying to cooperate where they can and find where they must. It varies from country to country. And China has certain advantage. Certainly, I think President Xi Jinping's visit to Singapore and Vietnam sort of have made quite a lot of achievement in Singapore, Vietnam have also scored. And partly is because there's so much emphasis on economic cooperation, and China is a growing economic power, and other countries can benefit from China's initiative. But at the same time, there are also other issues, sort of in the South China Sea, and certainly the competition with the United States over TPP and some other issues. It's a complex picture, but all the countries are making their diplomatic moves.